an economy that means that anyone who earns over £60,000, which is a huge amount of money, anyone who earns £60,000 is probably in the top 5%. Anyone who earns over £100,000 is like 0.5%, okay? So if you're earning the average salary in this country, which is like £26,000, £27,000, no bank's going to touch you. And what's ironic about that is that you're probably paying rent in a house for probably 3 times more than what you would be paying in a mortgage. So if you were living in London, renting out a room in a decent location, you're paying probably £1,000 for that room, okay, in a 3-bedroom place. But that whole property, if you managed to get a mortgage 5-10 years ago, the mortgage is probably not worth more than £1,000. And so the fundamental question I always ask people is, are the house prices that you are expecting people to buy, does that house price have any relationship with the market and the economy that you're asking them to participate in? And I take that example from Norway, Sweden, and those Scandinavian countries. You cannot pay somebody in Norway, Oslo, a very expensive place if you've ever been, a cleaner working in downtown Oslo, if she or he wants to live in downtown Oslo, the employer has to pay her not what he or she thinks is a decent salary, but you have to pay that person what they can afford to live to be able to work in that location.
And that's something that's enforced by
law. By law. So if you're expecting this person to clean your building or your house, or you're expecting them to work, you have to pay them a salary that is commensurate with that place and that location.
Yeah. So it would be good to try and unpick why we've ended up with that disconnect. What are your thoughts, Hannah?
Well, I mean, wages and growth
Yeah.
have just not kept pace in any shape or form with the property economy. You know, there's just a complete disconnect between those two. So, you know, if you're like me and you're lucky enough to have bought a flat in actually the late 1990s, I was able to do that on a, you know, fairly modest salary, 3 times my salary. I think I earned £30,000 at that time, and I could buy quite a reasonable place. And that has gone up, you know, that I bought that for under £100,000, and it's now worth £700,000. That same property, I don't live there, but you know, it shows you that differential. So I always say I earn far more by being asleep than actually I do in my job. You know, because so the property economy just operates on a different level, and you know, it's inconceivable that we would intervene in, you know, the way you're talking about in Oslo, that we'd say, oh, well, you know, wages have to keep pace with that. I mean, it's perfectly possible to intervene in the economy and do all sorts with house price inflation and with other kinds of inflation. I mean, Germany, for example, hasn't witnessed any of this sort of inflation. Property prices have remained broadly stable while we've seen these huge rises. But it depends how you manage your economy. And we have allowed property really to take the lead. And I think in the post-financial crash, like I said, I think a combination of factors, probably 3 key factors: the sorts of properties we're building and who we're building them for. All of these luxury apartments which are being built all over London, a lot for foreign investment. Then we've got the impact of quantitative easing, which is the policy of creating trillions of pounds of new money, which we've repeatedly seen in the economy since the crash, which has massively boosted property price inflation.
Could you explain how that's happened?
Yeah, I mean, well, if I could really explain it, I'd probably have a very different kind of job and, you know, be a very sought after person.
For people who are starting, you know, what's the basic relationship between quantitative easing and...
I mean, quantitative easing was the policy, you're really putting me on the spot now, was the policy that was put in place by the Federal Reserve in the States, by the European Central Bank and the Bank of England to basically saved the banks during the financial crisis, and they created trillions of pounds of money to save the banks from bankruptcy. And they printed 45 billion pounds, I think, between 2008 and 2016. And it was known to be quite a risky policy. And, you know, the Bank of England wanted to wind it back, and it was known that it was inflationary. And Bank of England research has shown that it boosted what's called asset prices, and in particular, within those assets, property prices. It massively boosted property price inflation, and it went very much in the hands of the very richest people who ploughed it into property. Then in 2020, we actually had another massive round of quantitative easing because of the COVID pandemic. And in just that year alone, we had £650 billion of quantitative easing. So I think now what we're seeing actually is the inflationary impact of that tranche. And then just a couple of weeks ago, with the 65 billion that was used to basically save the pension funds, that was a very similar approach again. So we have this monetary policy which is actually massively inflationary. So it's really, really difficult to see how, while we've got that economic backdrop, you know, we can do much about highest price inflation.